Thank you very much. Well, I would just, to begin with, like to just echo what the other committee chairs have said in terms of being grateful to the organizers of this symposium. It's a really good opportunity and excellent arrangements. I would also like to thank the audience already now for remaining in the room for listening to yet another committee. What I will do to reward that is that I will run through the activities within Committee 5, which of course is about protection of the environment. And in order to start that, I just remind you of the mission, what Committee 5 has been tasked with doing, which is to develop a system for radiation protection of the environment, which is aligned with the radiation protection system for protection of people, and which is aligned with the environmental protection system, which is intended for protection of the environment from just about everything else. And the committee has done that over the last 10 years by gradually developing a system which is parallel to the system of protection of people. So illustrated like this, if we start with planned emergency and existing exposure situations, we will end up with some level of radionuclides in the environment. The way that we protect people is to apply a system which is based on our knowledge and our databases on reference male and female and children and what have you, things that John Harrison was talking about previously, or representative persons, if we like to do that. And we, on the basis of that, we derive the dose limits, the constraints, and reference levels that we need in order to put it in practice and in order to make sure that we actually are protecting people. Now, what Committee 5 has been doing is to do pretty much the same, but do it for reference animals and plants, and selected a set of 12 such reference animals and plants and developed the databases around them. Now, with all due respect to the variability in human composition, size, not to mention nature, there's quite a difference when we talk about protection of the environment and the variability of the organisms, or the whole range of organisms that we have in the environment. But there is a need to congregate the information that we have out there around something that can be useful, and those are the reference animals and plants. And on the basis of that, we have identified a derived consideration of reference levels, and I would like to emphasize the word consideration, because these are dose rate bands for environmental exposure where you should pause and consider whether you have an environmental issue that you need to deal with. And also emphasize the word reference level, because these should not be interpreted as any strict limits or anything like that. They are reference levels, just as we have reference levels for existing and emergency exposure situations. And if you have that together, you can actually take a decision on protection of people and protection of the environment that is integrated, that's made use of an integrated system. Now, obviously, in many situations, it's going to be the left part of this pathway that dominates, but there are situations, activities, where it would be prudent to consider both pathways and take a decision on the basis of information on both. And there are also situations where probably the right one would dominate. The reference animals and plants, as I said, are aggregated types of living organisms in the natural environment, in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. And they are specific organisms that have been identified as the reference animals and plants around which the databases have been generated. And the DCRLs, the derived consideration reference levels, where you should make some consideration of environmental protection, broadly falls into 3 different bands, all spanning 1 order of magnitude of environmental dose rates in the way that is outlined here. Now, if you start with an exposure situation, or a situation that gives rise to exposure to put it like that. What you can do is, of course, an assessment, and in the end you come up with a management decision. And you can take the management decision and you can, through protective actions, you can change the situation of exposure. Or if you have a management system already from the beginning, you apply it to the exposure that you have, you deal with it if necessary, and you can make an assessment of whether that was successful and whether you need to do something that is more stringent or less stringent. But you need something that connects these two endpoints, and that's essentially what Committee 5 has been working on for the last 10 years. You need a system for assessing the exposure. You need an understanding of the effects. You need to form a view on basically how concerned should I be, what are the levels in the environment where we should start to express some concern or feel some concern. And you would then apply that to the planned existing and emergency exposure situations. And there's nothing particular here that doesn't really exist already for protection of people. You need transfer, you need to know things about internal, external exposure. You need the dose conversion coefficients. You need to understand the effects and so on. But what's of course unique here is that we do have the reference animals and plants, and you need to have a fairly good understanding of the biology of these reference animals and plants, because this is really the fundamental difference between the system for protection of people and protection of the environment. And here again is where I got the reference animals and plants, where we aggregate the biological information in order to have some sort of understanding of what might be going on here. The exposure part, of course, requires quite a bit of attention to dosimetry, and we have had, and we are on our way after some time to wrap up 2 task groups that have been working for quite some time, and just summarize a few of the features here around dosimetry or that contribute to dosimetry. Of course, we don't have a quantity here, a radiation protection quantity. We are talking about absorbed dose, or we are talking about absorbed dose rate rather. Usually a whole body averaged, and considering also uniform exposure or uniform internal distribution. Radiation protection endpoints, we have to look at different ones from protection of people. RBE could become an issue. Weighting, we don't really have any weighting factors here for different quality of radiation. This is not because people haven't been talking about it for the last 2 or 3 decades, and there have been various proposals here. Norman Gentner, John Pentreath, and other people have put out their different proposals for weighting factors. And as I said, we have the reference levels for radiation protection purposes. I just show you one. I just show you one example here from task group 72 on RBE. And this is an example that this is what you can get on a good day, and that means that you don't have really in many of these situations a lot of data. This happens to be for reproductive endpoints, and it's the tritium exposure, or exposure beta radiation from tritium. And what you see here, what this is here to illustrate is really that you got quite a bit of variability. You haven't got a lot of data for many of the reference animals and plants. And the data that you have are normally for those rates that are 1, 2, or 3 orders of magnitude higher than the DCRLs. So I don't want to preempt what the task group 72 is going to come up with, but it is time, I think, because this is a debate that's going on, and you can get involved into various discussions, or rather arguments, using the definition that Claire had before about being mutually ignorant about the importance about RBE, in particular in relation to alpha, and you can come into those discussions all the time. So what ICRP needs to do in the views of task group 72 is to come up with an authoritative statement on this particular issue, because there isn't one from ICRP presently. The other task group in dosimetry is the one on improved dosimetry, task group 74, and I have shown this picture before. It's still represents ICRP's view of nature, which is really a number of ellipsoid blobs walking around or swimming around or flying around, and with a homogeneous distribution of radionuclides internally and so on. And the ellipsoid is not a bad way of representing, of course, almost everything in the world, and some are more elongated and some are much less elongated. And we may just look around in the room here to see evidence of that, including myself. And but it doesn't work always necessarily. If we talk about a tree, if we talk about some other organism, it doesn't necessarily work. Anyway, what Task Group 74 has been doing is to expand the data that we already had in publication 108 and expand that to include the radionuclides of publication 107, expand the exposure scenarios, explore allometric relationship, and also develop a web-based dose conversion coefficient calculator that I'm sure that Alexander Ulanovsky, who has been working a lot of this, and CFI member, will describe to you later. He is having a presentation tomorrow afternoon, I believe it is. As I said, the two task groups actually are now about to wrap up. I would say that the data generation work is done. We're not going to generate any more data. It's a question of now getting them out there. I think that Task Group 74 in particular can be getting out there for public consultation relatively expediently. With Task Group 72, we have a couple of issues still to resolve. We are going to have a meeting with Committee 1 and Committee 2 on that particular issue during the week here. And I should also acknowledge the participation of Committee 1 and Committee 2 in these two task groups. The software tool BiotaDCC, as it's called, just show you the first frame here, and if you want any details on this, please talk to Alexander, don't talk to me. And but he has told me that it's simple, flexible, fast, and web-based, and I have no reason to doubt that. And so, and the way that we are going to make that accessible is something that we need to sort out within the Commission, and probably Chris will have to take a close look at. Now, turning to effects, I think, of course, we are now a few years after the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and a variety of reports have resulted from that. And I only give you here a couple of examples, so 3 examples of modification of phenotypic modification in butterflies, fir trees, swallows in Fukushima, which is obviously a continuation of the swallows in Chernobyl, which was already something that was discussed then. There are also a number of other reports that I haven't mentioned here, including actually a recent report from the UK, long-term follow-up from Chernobyl, that speaks a completely different language. And the only thing I want to say in relation to this is that it would probably be foolish to ignore observations if the observations are done in a very careful manner. It would probably also be foolish to immediately jump to the conclusion that these are radiation-induced. And yet again, rather than having an argument about this, as Claire pointed out before, we should have a mature discussion. And we haven't had that yet, and we haven't got any conclusion from that. But I would like to point out, though, that in relation to environmental exposures after the accident, and these are values from Okuma town, which is obviously very close to the reactors from June 2011, you see the yellowish amber fields here that for some of the reference animals and plants, environmental exposures are actually well above the DCRLs. Now, that's only a few months after. If you go a few months more, it will have decreased by a factor of 10 or so. So we don't really know the implications here, but what we do know is that one of the essential elements is to get the DCRLs right. If the DCRLs are right, then the system is in trouble. I'm very confident that the DCRLs are right. But the task group 99 is actually going to look at that and going to do that in various ways. And I'm not showing this so that you all will, leap to your feet and say, oh God, they are going to voxelize everything on Earth. It's really about understanding what are the uncertainties here and what are the important issues in order to convince ourselves that the DCRLs are still valid. And if they are not, of course, they have to be discussed. A few words on application. Publication 124 was, has been mentioned several times, a very good collaboration between Committee 5 and Committee 4. And the way it's being applied to planned exposure situations is on the left part here, that we look at it as if you come with environmental exposures up towards the lower end of the DCRL, the situation, and that is likely not going to happen very often. We are not likely, it's not likely going to happen very often with protection of people either. Situation may be different for existing exposure situations, and David Copplestone is giving a presentation today in the afternoon on that particular issue, and will demonstrate some examples of that. Another thing, and always when I talk about this subject, I cannot resist the temptation to show you a picture of a kangaroo. And so here is one. But what I wanted to say here, that for some specific circumstances, it might not be that the the reference animal and plant is good enough. You might actually have to go beyond that and identify what are representative organisms and base your assessment on that. Because if you take a kangaroo, for instance, the representative or the reference animal is a large herbivorous mammal, and that happens in the ICRP terminology to be a deer. So the question is, how similar or dissimilar is a deer from a kangaroo? Well, maybe not that dissimilar, but I could also have shown you a platypus, which of course spends most of its time in the water and lay eggs. And then you start to scratch your head and think, well, how can I use the RAP here? And that's something where some guidance needs to be developed. And eventually we will hopefully come to a situation, and this is something that Don was alluding to, potential collaboration here in the future with Committee 4 on arriving to an integrated view of understanding, in this particular case, a planned situation, where you can look at the authorized releases from an integrated point of view, looking at protection of people and protection of the environment. Yeah, that's essentially wraps up my presentation. I just wanted to say that this just outlines the evolution, which is probably a good word in this context, of the system through the different publications that have been produced here. Publication 99 actually predates Committee 5, and the ongoing work and where it's going. And the important thing to point out here is that it has actually been road tested on a number of occasions. It's been road tested in the UNSCEAR assessment, been road tested in the London Convention. IAEA has used it in the safety guides, and the OSPAR Convention on the Protection of the Northeast Atlantic and so on. So there's plenty of experience from road testing of this system. And the people that have made this possible is Committee 5, this is the current Committee 5. We have, of course, a few more people that participated before, and also a few people that have participated in various task groups. And so many thanks to Committee 5. And that really finishes my talk, but I give you one more kangaroo before I finish. So thank you very much.